A black woman adopted white triplets, determined to give them the love and home they deserved. But years later, just as life seemed to settle, she receives an unexpected surprise from her past that turns everything upside down. What shocking revelation could change her world forever? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Mary's tired eyes scanned her cluttered apartment as she moved quietly through the dimly lit space. The walls, once a cheerful yellow, now seemed faded and worn, much like her own spirits. With a heavy sigh, she filled a glass with water and grabbed John's evening medication. The floorboards creaked beneath her feet as she made her way to the bedroom. John lay propped up on pillows, his once robust frame now thin and frail. Mary's heart ached at the sight of her beloved husband, but she forced a smile as she entered the room. "Hey there, handsome," she said softly, perching on the edge of the bed. "Time for your meds." John's eyes fluttered open and he managed a weak smile. "There's my angel," he whispered, his voice raspy. Mary helped him sit up, her strong hand supporting his back. She watched as he swallowed the pills, making sure he took every last one. As she set the glass down on the nightstand, John caught her hand in his. "Mary," he said, his eyes serious, "we need to talk." A knot formed in Mary's stomach. She knew that tone. It was the one he used when he had something important to say. "What is it, baby?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. John took a deep breath, wincing slightly at the effort. I don't think I have much time left, Mary." "Don't talk like that," Mary said quickly, her free hand reaching up to cup his face. "The doctors said the new medication might help. We just have to give it time." But John shook his head slowly. "We both know that's not true. I can feel it, Mary. My time is running out." Tears welled up in Mary's eyes, spilling down her cheeks. She wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, but the words wouldn't come. Deep down, she knew he was right. "I'm worried about you," John continued, his thumb gently stroking the back of her hand. "About what will happen to you when I'm gone." Mary sniffled, wiping at her eyes with her free hand. "I'll be fine," she insisted, but her voice trembled. "Don't you worry about me." John's eyes softened with love and concern. "But I do worry, my love. You work so hard, taking care of me, working all those jobs. Who's going to take care of you?" Mary shook her head, unable to speak. The thought of life without John was too painful to bear. "I've been thinking," John said slowly, his voice growing weaker. Maybe you should consider adopting a child before I'm gone." Mary's head snapped up, her eyes wide with surprise. "Hear me out," he said gently. "You have so much love to give, Mary. And I know how much you've always wanted to be a mother. A child would give you someone to care for, to love, someone to keep you company when I'm not here anymore." Mary stopped pacing, her shoulders slumping. "I can't even think about that right now," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "All I can think about is you getting better." She returned to the bed, sitting down and taking John's hand in both of hers. "You're going to be fine with these new medications," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You have to be." Tears streamed down Mary's face as she looked at her husband. John's eyes were filled with love and a deep sadness. He opened his mouth to speak again, but exhaustion overtook him. His eyelids drooped, and within moments he had drifted off to sleep. Mary sat there for a long time, holding John's hand and watching the rise and fall of his chest. Her mind whirled with thoughts of the future, a future she couldn't bear to imagine without John by her side. The idea of adopting a child seemed impossible, a dream too far out of reach. As the night deepened around her, Mary finally stood up, her joints stiff from sitting so long. She leaned over and placed a gentle kiss on John's forehead before quietly leaving the room. Memories flooded Mary's mind, bittersweet and vivid. She remembered the day they got married, both of them young and full of hope. How they'd talked about having a big family, filling their home with the laughter of children. But life had other plans. The years passed, and no matter how hard they tried, they couldn't conceive. Now here they were, John slipping away from her, and their dreams of a family still unfulfilled. Mary's eyes filled with tears. She blinked them away. As the night wore on, Mary found herself imagining what it might be like to adopt a child. Would it be a boy or a girl? The thoughts both excited and terrified her. She pictured herself taking a child to the park, reading bedtime stories, helping with homework, all the things she and John had dreamed of doing together. But then reality would crash back in. How could she manage on her own? How could she give a child the life they deserved when she was barely keeping her head above water? The first light of dawn was peeking through the curtains when John woke up. Mary entered his room, putting on a brave smile as he got back up. "Good morning, sweetheart," she said softly, leaning in to kiss his forehead. John blinked slowly, his eyes focusing on her face. "Mary," he whispered, his voice rough with sleep. "You've been up all night, haven't you?" Mary shook her head, but John knew her too well. He squeezed her hand weakly. "I've been thinking about what you said," Mary admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. John's eyes brightened slightly. "About adopting?" Mary nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. "Oh, Mary," John said, his voice filled with love. "I know it's a lot to ask, but I want to see you happy and fulfilled even after I'm gone." Tears spilled down Mary's cheeks. "How can I be happy without you?" she asked, her voice breaking. John reached up with a shaky hand to wipe away her tears. "Because you're the strongest person I know," he said. "And because love has a way of healing even the deepest wounds." Mary looked into John's eyes, seeing all the love and hope he held for her. She took a deep breath, feeling something shift inside her. "Okay," she said softly. I'll visit the orphanage tomorrow." John's face lit up with a smile that seemed to erase years of illness. "Really?" Mary nodded, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and excitement. "I promise," she said, sealing her words with a gentle kiss on John's lips. The next morning, Mary woke up early, her heart fluttering with a mix of excitement and anxiety. She sat on the edge of the bed, watching John. Gently, she touched his arm. "John," she whispered, "I'm going to the orphanage today, just like I promised." John's eyes fluttered open, a weak smile spreading across his face. "That's wonderful, Mary. I'm so proud of you." Mary leaned down and kissed his forehead. "I'll be back soon. Rest easy, my love." With a deep breath, Mary gathered her courage and headed out. The drive to the orphanage felt both too long and too short. Before she knew it, she was standing in front of a weathered brick building with faded lettering above the door. Hope's Haven Orphanage. Mary's hand trembled as she reached for the doorbell. A moment later, the door swung open, revealing a tall woman with graying hair and kind eyes. "Hello, you must be Mary," the woman said warmly. "I'm Ms. Thompson, the director. We spoke on the phone. Please come in." Mary stepped inside, immediately enveloped by the sounds of children playing and laughing. The hallways were lined with colorful artwork, crayon drawings of houses, families, and dreams yet to be fulfilled. "Let me show you around," Ms. Thompson said, leading Mary through the building. As they walked, Mary's eyes took in every detail. Faded toys sat in corners, well-loved and waiting for the next child to bring them to life. In one room, a group of children huddled around a volunteer reading a story. Their eyes were wide with wonder, momentarily forgetting their circumstances. Mary's heart ached. Each face she saw was a reminder of a child in need of love, of family. She thought of John, of their dreams of filling a home with laughter and joy. It all felt so overwhelming. "And here," Ms. Thompson said, pulling Mary from her thoughts, "is our infant room." They stepped into a quieter space, filled with cribs and the soft coos of babies. Mary's eyes scanned the room, taking in each tiny face. Then, in one corner, she spotted something that made her heart skip a beat. 3 identical cribs were pushed close together, and in them lay 3 tiny white babies, all huddled together. Triplets. Mary moved closer. drawn by an inexplicable pull. The babies, sensing her presence, turned their little faces towards her. Their eyes, bright and curious, seemed to look right into her soul. "Those are our triplets," Ms. Thompson explained, her voice tinged with sadness. "They've been here for months now. Unfortunately, no one has shown interest in adopting them." "Why not?" Mary asked, unable to tear her eyes away from the babies. Ms. Thompson sighed. "It's the perceived high cost of raising triplets. Many prospective parents feel overwhelmed by the idea of adopting 3 children at once. It's a shame, really. They're wonderful babies, but they need so much care." Mary watched as one of the triplets reached out, grasping the tiny hand of its sibling. The sight stirred something deep within her. She thought of John, of the family they had dreamed of having together. These 3 little ones clinging to each other embodied that dream in a way she couldn't have imagined. "I'll take them," Mary said, the words tumbling out before she could second-guess herself. Ms. Thompson's eyebrows shot up in surprise. "All 3? Are you sure? It's a big responsibility, especially for a single parent." Mary nodded, feeling more certain with each passing moment. "Yes, I'm sure. They deserve to be loved, to have a family." The director hesitated, her eyes flicking between Mary and the triplets. I hope you don't mind me asking, but given your skin color, do you think that might cause any issues?" Mary felt a flicker of anger, but she pushed it aside. She understood the concern, even if it stung. "It's okay," she said firmly. "Love doesn't see color. These babies need a home, and I have one to give them. That's what matters." Ms. Thompson nodded, a smile spreading across her face. "You're absolutely right, Mary. Let's start the paperwork." The next few hours passed in a blur of forms and signatures. Mary's head spun with information about feeding schedules, doctor's appointments, and the myriad details of caring for 3 infants. But through it all, her resolve never wavered. As she prepared to leave with the triplets, Mary took one last look at the triplets. They were sleeping now, peaceful and unaware of how their lives were about to change. Mary's heart swelled with love and determination. When she got home, heart raced, a mix of excitement and anxiety swirling in her chest. She paused at the door, taking a deep breath before pushing it open. "John?" she called softly, her voice wavering. "I'm home, and I've brought someone. Well, 3 someones." She heard a weak cough from the bedroom. "Mary, is that you?" Carefully, Mary set the carriers down in the living room and made her way to John's bedside. He looked paler than when she'd left, his skin almost translucent against the white sheets. But as she approached, his eyes flickered open, a spark of curiosity in their depths. "What do you mean, 3 someones?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Mary's lips trembled into a smile. "I went to the orphanage like we talked about, and, well, I found them, John. Our family." She hurried back to the living room, gently lifting one of the babies from its carrier. The tiny girl blinked sleepily as Mary cradled her close, bringing her into the bedroom. John's eyes widened as he saw the infant. "Oh, Mary," he breathed, a trembling hand reaching out. Mary carefully placed the baby girl in the crook of John's arm, watching as his face transformed. The lines of pain that had been etched there for so long seemed to soften, replaced by a look of wonder. "She's beautiful," John whispered, his finger gently stroking the baby's cheek. "But you said 3? Mary nodded, her own eyes filling with tears. "Triplets, John. 2 boys and a girl. I couldn't leave them there, all alone." She quickly retrieved the other 2 babies, placing them gently on the bed next to John. He looked from one tiny face to another, his expression a mix of joy and disbelief. "Triplets," he repeated, his voice filled with awe. "Oh, Mary, they're perfect." As John interacted with the babies, cooing softly and letting them grasp his fingers, Mary saw a change come over him. The weariness that had been weighing him down seemed to lift, if only for a moment. Leaving the kids with John, Mary then headed to the diner to cover at least one shift for the day. Her hands trembled as she poured coffee for a late-night customer at the diner. Her eyes were heavy with exhaustion, but she forced a smile, knowing every tip counted towards the next can of formula or pack of diapers. The clock on the wall seemed to mock her, ticking away the precious hours she could be spending with her babies and John. Just as she finished wiping down a table, her phone buzzed in her pocket. Mary's heart skipped a beat. She never got calls this late unless it was an emergency. With shaking hands, she answered, "Hello? Mary? It's Mrs. Turner from next door," came the frantic voice of her elderly neighbor. "There's been an accident. John?" Mary's world seemed to tilt on its axis. She gripped the edge of the table to steady herself as Mrs. Turner explained what had happened. The words, "John," "collapsed," and "ambulance" pierced through the fog of her exhaustion like shards of ice. "The kids?" Mary managed to choke out. "They're with me, dear. Don't worry about them. You just get to the hospital as quick as you can," Mrs. Turner assured her. Mary's mind raced. She needed to leave now, but how? As if in answer to her silent plea, her boss emerged from the kitchen. "Mary, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost," he said, concern etching his features. In a rush of words, Mary explained the situation. Her boss's face softened with understanding. "Go," he said simply. "Family comes first. We'll manage here." Gratitude washed over Mary as she hastily untied her apron and grabbed her purse. She burst through the diner's doors into the night, barely registering the cold rain that immediately began to soak through her uniform. The street was nearly deserted at this hour, and Mary's frantically waving arm failed to hail a taxi. With a frustrated cry, she began to run, her shoes splashing through puddles and her heart pounding in her chest. The rain pelted her face, mixing with the tears that had begun to fall. Mary's mind was a whirlwind of fear and worry. What if she was too late? What if John... No, she couldn't think like that. He had to be okay. The kids needed him. She needed him. The hospital was close by, but during that time of distress, even such a small distance seemed miles away. Mary's lungs burned as she pushed herself harder. The hospital loomed ahead, its lights a beacon in the stormy night. She burst through the emergency room doors, gasping for breath and dripping rainwater onto the sterile floor. "My husband," she panted to the startled receptionist. "John Smith. He was brought in by ambulance." The next few minutes were a blur as Mary was directed to a waiting area. She paced back and forth, leaving wet footprints on the linoleum, her mind racing with all the things left unsaid, all the moments she wished she could have back. A doctor appeared, his face serious. "Mrs. Smith?" Mary's heart seemed to stop as she turned to face him, praying for good news but fearing the worst. The doctor's voice was gentle but serious. "Mrs. Smith, I'm afraid your husband's condition is critical. We're doing everything we can, but his chances of survival are low." Mary felt her knees go weak and she gripped the edge of John's bed for support. "But he was fine just a few hours ago," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Sometimes these things happen suddenly. With the stage 3 cancer that he had, it was only a matter of time before this happened. I hope you know that." The doctor explained softly. "We'll continue to monitor him closely. If you'd like to stay with him, you're welcome to." Mary nodded numbly, pulling a chair close to John's bedside. As the doctor left, she took John's hand in hers, noticing how cold it felt. "John," she whispered, "I'm here. Please, you have to fight. The babies need you, I need you." Time seemed to stand still as Mary sat there, her thumb gently stroking John's hand. She prayed silently, begging for a miracle. The steady beep of the heart monitor was her only companion in the quiet room. Suddenly, Mary felt a slight pressure on her hand. Her eyes flew open to see John's eyelids fluttering. "John?" she said, her voice filled with hope. John's eyes opened slowly, focusing on Mary's face. A faint smile tugged at his lips. "Mary," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Tears streamed down Mary's face as she leaned closer. "I'm here, love. You're going to be okay. You have to be." John's grip on her hand tightened slightly. "Mary," he said again, each word an effort. "I love you. Take care of our new family." "No, John, please," Mary sobbed, but she could see the light fading from his eyes. With one last gentle squeeze of her hand, John's eyes closed and his chest fell still. The heart monitor flatlined, its steady tone piercing through Mary's anguished cries. As the reality of John's passing washed over her, Mary felt as if her world had shattered. She lay her head on his chest, her tears soaking into the hospital gown. "I love you too," she whispered, her voice choked with grief. After finishing all the formalities, Mary's steps were heavy as she approached Mrs. Turner's door. The weight of grief and responsibility pressed down on her shoulders, making each movement feel like a monumental effort. She knocked softly, trying to compose herself before facing her kind neighbor. Mrs. Turner opened the door, her face etched with concern. "Oh, Mary," she said softly, pulling her into a gentle hug. "I'm so sorry, dear." Mary nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. She could hear the soft coos and gurgles of the triplets coming from inside the apartment. "They've been angels," Mrs. Turner said, leading Mary inside. "Such sweet little ones." The babies were nestled together, their tiny hands reaching out to each other. Mary's heart clenched at the sight. These were her children now, hers alone. "Thank you so much for watching them," Mary managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Turner patted her arm. "It was no trouble at all, dear. If you need anything at all, you just let me know, okay?" Mary nodded again, gathering the triplets and their few belongings. With Mrs. Turner's help, she made her way back to her own apartment, the reality of her new life settling in with each step. As she closed the door behind her, the silence of the apartment seemed to echo. John's absence was palpable, as if the very air had changed without him there. Mary set the babies down in their crib, her hands shaking slightly as she tucked them in. The next few days blurred together in a haze of exhaustion and constant motion. The triplets' needs seemed endless: feeding, changing, soothing, repeat. She'd stumble through her shifts at the diner, her mind foggy from lack of sleep, only to rush home and dive right back into caring for the babies. Mrs. Turner was a godsend, watching the triplets whenever she could. But the kind elderly woman had her own limitations, and Mary hated to burden her too much. "You're doing an amazing job, dear," Mrs. Turner would say, patting Mary's hand. "Those babies are lucky to have you." Mary would smile weakly, grateful for the encouragement, but feeling like she was barely keeping her head above water. The daycare was a necessity, but it stretched Mary's already thin budget to the breaking point. She picked up extra shifts whenever possible, her body aching from the long hours on her feet. One particularly grueling evening, Mary trudged home from the daycare, a baby carrier in each hand and the third strapped to her chest. The triplets were fussy, tired, and hungry after a long day. Mary's arms felt like lead, her back screaming in protest. As she neared their apartment building, she noticed a group of neighbors gathered on the sidewalk. Their conversation died down as she approached, replaced by pointed looks and hushed whispers. "Well, would you look at that?" one woman said, her voice carrying. "Isn't it odd?" "I know," another replied. "A black woman with 3 white babies? It just doesn't look right." Mary felt her cheeks burn, but she kept her eyes forward. She wanted to shout at them, to explain that love knew no color, that these were her children in every way that mattered. But she was too tired, too worn down to fight. Instead, she held her head high and kept walking, whispering words of comfort to the babies. "It's okay, little ones," she murmured. "Mama's got you. We're almost home." As she climbed the stairs to her apartment, Mary felt the weight of those judgmental stares settle in her heart. It was just one more burden to bear, one more challenge in a life that already felt overwhelming. But when she finally made it inside and looked down at the 3 tiny faces that depended on her, Mary felt a surge of determination. These babies needed her, and she would not let them down, no matter what anyone else thought. Years passed in a blur of sleepless nights, endless diaper changes, and first steps. Before Mary knew it, her tiny triplets had grown into energetic toddlers, each with their own unique personality. As they reached school age, Mary faced a new challenge, balancing their education with her demanding work schedule. The local daycare became a lifeline, allowing Mary to maintain her long hours at work. But it came with its own set of difficulties. Every morning, as she dropped the children off, she felt the weight of curious stares and hushed whispers from other parents. "There's that black woman with the white kids again," she'd overhear, the words stinging even after all this time. Mary did her best to brush it off, focusing instead on her children's bright smiles and excited chatter about their day ahead. She'd kneel down, straightening little collars and smoothing wild curls. "Be good for your teachers," she'd say, planting a kiss on each forehead. "Mama loves you." As the triplets settled into their school routine, Mary found herself constantly juggling her work shifts with their various events and activities. She'd rush from the diner, still in her uniform, to catch the end of a school play or art show. The exhaustion was bone deep, but seeing her children's faces light up when they spotted her in the audience made it all worthwhile. Still, she couldn't escape the feeling of being an outsider. At every school function, Mary found herself standing alone, acutely aware of the divide between her and the other parents. They'd cluster in tight-knit groups, sharing inside jokes and arranging playdates. Mary longed to join in, to form connections with other mothers who understood the challenges of raising young children. But the wall of prejudice seemed insurmountable. One crisp autumn evening, Mary hurried into the school for a parent-teacher meeting. She'd barely made it, having begged a co-worker to cover the last half hour of her shift. Her uniform was wrinkled, her hair hastily pulled back, but she was determined to be there for her children. As she entered the classroom, Mary felt the familiar prickle of eyes on her. She took a deep breath and made her way to an empty chair, trying to ignore the whispers that followed her. The teacher, Mrs. Johnson, smiled warmly as she began discussing the triplets' progress. Mary listened intently, her heart swelling with pride at each positive comment about her children's academic achievements and kind nature. Just as the meeting was wrapping up, a well-dressed woman sitting nearby leaned over to Mary. With a condescending smile, she said, "It's so nice of you to attend these meetings. The children's parents must really appreciate having such a dedicated nanny." The room fell silent. Mary felt a flush of anger and hurt rise in her cheeks. She took a deep breath, reminding herself to stay calm for her children's sake. "I'm not their nanny," Mary said firmly, meeting the woman's gaze. "I'm their mother." The woman's eyes widened in surprise, and she stammered out an awkward apology. But the damage was done. Mary could feel the other parents' stares boring into her, a mix of curiosity and judgment. As the meeting dispersed, Mary gathered her things quickly, eager to escape the suffocating atmosphere. Mrs. Johnson approached her, concern evident in her eyes. "Mary, I'm so sorry about that," she said softly. "Your children are wonderful, and it's clear how much you love them." Mary managed a weak smile, grateful for the support but still feeling raw from the encounter. She thanked Mrs. Johnson and hurried out of the classroom, her eyes stinging with unshed tears. In the quiet of the empty hallway, Mary leaned against the wall, allowing herself a moment of vulnerability. The constant battle against prejudice and misunderstanding was exhausting. In moments like these, she felt utterly alone, isolated from the community she longed to be a part of. Despite the challenges, Mary found joy in small moments with her triplets. Every evening, after her long shift at the diner, she'd come home tired but eager to spend time with her children. The sound of their excited voices calling "Mommy's home" never failed to lift her spirits. Bedtime was Mary's favorite part of the day. She'd gather the triplets on the worn but cozy couch, their little bodies snuggled close as she opened a well-loved storybook. Her voice, soft and soothing, brought tales of faraway lands and brave heroes to life. The children's eyes would grow wide with wonder, and Mary delighted in their questions and giggles. "Mommy, why did the princess help the frog?" one would ask. "Because kindness is important, sweetie," Mary would explain. "We should always try to help others, even if they look different from us." One particularly challenging day at the diner left Mary feeling drained and discouraged. A difficult customer had berated her over a minor mistake, and her manager had been unsympathetic. As she trudged up the stairs to her apartment, Mary felt the weight of her struggles pressing down on her. But when she opened the door, the sight that greeted her instantly lifted her spirits. The triplets were huddled around the coffee table, crayons scattered everywhere, their faces lit up with excitement. "Mommy, Mommy, we made something for you," they cried in unison, rushing to greet her. Mary knelt down, enveloping them in a warm hug. "What did you make, my darlings?" With pride, they presented her with a colorful drawing. Mary's breath caught in her throat as she took it in. There, in the center of the page, was a figure unmistakably meant to be her, surrounded by 3 smaller figures, the triplets. They had drawn themselves holding hands, big smiles on their crayon faces. Above the picture, in wobbly letters, they had written, "Our family." Tears pricked Mary's eyes as she gazed at the simple yet profound artwork. In that moment, all the day's frustrations melted away, replaced by an overwhelming sense of love and gratitude. "It's beautiful," she whispered, hugging her children close. "Thank you so much." Mary stood up, the drawing clutched carefully in her hand, and walked to the refrigerator. With reverence, she hung it front and center, securing it with a magnet. As the triplets grew older, Mary's love for them only deepened. But with their growth came new challenges, especially when they started junior high school. Mary had always known there might be difficulties, but she was determined to give her children the best education possible. She attended every school event, volunteered when she could, and made sure her voice was heard at PTA meetings. She wanted to show everyone that her family belonged there just as much as any other. Years passed and the triplets grew into young adults, each developing their own unique personalities and interests. At 18, they were on the cusp of adulthood, and Mary couldn't help but feel a mixture of pride and nostalgia as she watched them navigate their lives. Elijah, always the practical one, had discovered a passion for mechanics. He spent most of his free time at Joe's garage down the street, learning the ins and outs of car repair. Mary remembered the day he came home grease-stained and grinning to announce he'd fixed his first engine. "Mom, you should have seen it," he'd exclaimed, his eyes shining with excitement. "Joe said I've got a real talent for this stuff." Mary had hugged him tight, not minding the oil stains on her uniform. "I'm so proud of you, honey," she'd said, her heart swelling with love. Elijah's newfound skills didn't just fuel his passion. They also helped ease the family's financial burden. He started earning a modest wage at the garage, insisting on contributing to the household expenses despite Mary's protests. "You've done so much for us, Mom," he'd say, pressing a few crumpled bills into her hand. "Let me help out a little." Meanwhile, Emma and Ethan threw themselves into their studies with a determination that both impressed and worried Mary. She'd often find them hunched over textbooks late into the night, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of desk lamps. "You need to rest too," Mary would gently remind them, bringing them mugs of hot cocoa. Emma would look up, her eyes tired but determined. "We're okay, Mom. These scholarships are really competitive, and we want to make sure we have a shot." Ethan would nod in agreement. "Yeah, and maybe if we both get scholarships, it'll be easier on you, Mom." Mary's heart would ache at their words, touched by their consideration, but wishing they didn't have to worry so much about money at their age. Still, she couldn't help but beam with pride as she watched them grow into hard-working, kind young adults. As their 19th birthday approached, Mary began planning a small celebration. Money was tight as always, but she was determined to make the day special for her children. She requested a day off from the diner, a rare occurrence, and spent the morning decorating their small apartment with streamers and balloons. When the triplets returned home that evening, they were greeted by the sight of Mary standing in the middle of the living room, a homemade cake in her hands, and a wide smile on her face. "Happy birthday, my loves," she said, her voice filled with emotion. The triplets exchanged glances, looking both surprised and touched. Then, to Mary's astonishment, Ethan disappeared into the kitchen and returned with another cake box. "We have a surprise for you too, Mom," Emma said, her eyes twinkling. Elijah nodded, adding, We've been saving up for this. It's not much, but we wanted to do something special for you. Mary set down her cake as Ethan opened the box, revealing a beautiful store-bought designer dress. Her eyes welled up with tears as she took in the sight. "Oh, my babies," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. The triplets surrounded her, enveloping her in a group hug. "We just wanted to show you how much we appreciate everything you've done for us," Ethan said softly. Later that evening, as the triplets were cleaning up after their birthday celebration, Mary heard the familiar creak of the mailbox outside their apartment. Curious about mail arriving so late, she stepped out to check. Among the usual bills and advertisements was a plain white envelope with no return address. Mary's heart skipped a beat as she opened it, her hands trembling slightly. Inside was a handwritten note that made her blood run cold. "I have information about your kids' biological parents. They're alive. Meet me at Joe's Diner tomorrow at 2 p.m. if you want to know more. Come alone." Mary's mind raced as she read and reread the cryptic message. Who could have sent this? How did they know about the triplets? And more importantly, what did they know about their birth parents? She glanced back at the apartment, where she could hear the muffled laughter of her children. They seemed so happy, so content. The thought of disrupting their lives with this unexpected revelation made her stomach churn. For hours after the triplets went to bed, Mary sat at the kitchen table, staring at the letter. She imagined countless scenarios, some hopeful, others terrifying. What if the biological parents wanted to reclaim the triplets? What if they were in some kind of trouble and needed help? Or what if this was all some cruel joke? As the night wore on, Mary's resolve strengthened. She decided she would go to the meeting, but she wouldn't tell the triplets, at least not yet. They were just starting their adult lives, and she didn't want to burden them with this uncertainty. "I'll go," she whispered to herself, "and then I'll decide what to do next." With a heavy heart, Mary tucked the letter into her purse and tried to get some sleep, all the while wondering what tomorrow's meeting would bring. Next day, at exactly 2 p.m., Mary's heart raced as she approached the fancy restaurant. The gleaming glass doors and valet parking made her feel out of place in her simple dress and worn shoes. She took a deep breath, straightened her back, and walked in. The maitre d' eyed her skeptically. "Do you have a reservation, madam?" I'm meeting someone," Mary stammered, clutching her purse tightly. Just then, a well-dressed couple approached. The woman, tall and elegant in a designer dress, smiled warmly. "You must be Mary. We're so glad you could make it." Mary nodded, still feeling overwhelmed. The man, in an expensive suit, extended his hand. "I'm Robert, and this is my wife, Elizabeth. Shall we sit?" They led Mary to a secluded table in the corner. As they settled in, Mary couldn't help but notice how different they looked from her, polished, confident, and clearly wealthy. Elizabeth leaned forward, her eyes sparkling. "Mary, we can't thank you enough for coming. We have so much to tell you." Robert nodded, his expression serious. "We're the triplets' biological parents." Mary's world seemed to tilt. She gripped the edge of the table, trying to steady herself. You're their birth parents?" "Yes," Elizabeth said softly. "We know this must be a shock." Robert continued. "When we had the triplets, we were young and broke. We could barely take care of ourselves, let alone 3 babies. It was the hardest decision of our lives, but we knew we had to give them up for adoption." Elizabeth wiped a tear from her eye. "We've thought about them every day since." Mary listened, her heart pounding. She thought of her children at home, unaware of this meeting that could change their lives forever. What do you want after all these years? Why didn't you bother to even check upon them?" Mary managed to ask. Robert and Elizabeth exchanged glances. "We've built a successful business since then," Robert explained. "We're in a much better position now, financially and emotionally." Elizabeth reached across the table, almost touching Mary's hand but stopping short. "We'd like to reconnect with our children. Now that we can provide for them, give them opportunities." Mary felt as if the air had been sucked out of the room. She thought of all the struggles, the late nights, the sacrifices she'd made for her children. And now, these strangers wanted to sweep in and claim them? But then she remembered John's words from so long ago about giving the children all the love they deserved. She thought of how kind and compassionate her triplets had grown up to be. Wouldn't they want to know their birth parents? With a heavy heart but a steady voice, Mary said, "Okay, I understand. They deserve to know you, to have all the love possible in their lives." Robert and Elizabeth beamed, but Mary couldn't shake the worry gnawing at her insides. How would this change their lives? What would it mean for their family? As the couple began discussing plans to meet the triplets, Mary sat in stunned silence, her mind racing with concerns about the future. Mary then headed home, full of sadness and confusion. As she stepped inside, the familiar sights and sounds of home, the worn but cozy couch, the fridge humming softly in the kitchen, the faded family photos on the walls, seemed to mock her with their normalcy. She paced back and forth across the living room, her mind racing. How could she tell the triplets about their biological parents? What if they wanted to leave her for their wealthy birth parents? Mary's eyes fell on a framed picture of the triplets on their first day of high school. Their smiling faces beamed back at her, full of hope and promise. She remembered how proud she had felt that day, watching her children embark on a new chapter of their lives. As the hours ticked by, Mary found herself unable to sit still. She tidied up the already clean kitchen, reorganized the bookshelf, and even started sorting through old bills. Anything to keep her hands busy and her mind from spiraling into worst-case scenarios. When she heard the front door open and the familiar chatter of the triplets returning home, Mary took a deep breath, steeling herself for the conversation ahead. "Mom, we're home," Ethan called out. "In the kitchen, sweethearts," Mary replied, trying to keep her voice steady. The triplets filed into the kitchen, dropping their bags and settling around the small table. Mary busied herself with preparing dinner, grateful for the distraction. As they sat down to eat, Mary cleared her throat. "Kids, I have something to tell you." 3 pairs of eyes looked at her expectantly. "Tomorrow we're going to meet someone special," she said, her voice wavering slightly. It's someone who's been wanting to meet you for a long time." Emma tilted her head curiously. "Who is it, Mom? A relative we don't know about?" Mary shook her head. "No, not exactly, but they're important. You'll understand when you see them." Elijah furrowed his brow. "Why all the mystery, Mom? Is everything okay?" Mary forced a smile. "Everything's fine, sweetheart. I just think it's better if you meet them yourselves. It'll make more sense then." The triplets exchanged puzzled glances. "Okay, Mom," Ethan said slowly. "If you say so. We trust you." Those words, spoken so simply and sincerely, nearly broke Mary's composure. She blinked back tears and nodded. "So we're meeting them tomorrow?" Emma asked. "Yes, after school," Mary confirmed. "I'll pick you up and we'll go together." The triplets agreed, their curiosity evident in their expressions. As they continued eating and chatting about their day, Mary felt a mix of relief and apprehension. She had taken the first step, but the hardest part was yet to come. The next day, their small family clutched together when it was time to go. "So where are we going?" Ethan asked as they piled into the car. Mary took a deep breath. "It's a surprise. Just trust me, okay?" As they drove through increasingly upscale neighborhoods, the triplets' excitement grew. Finally, Mary turned into a long, winding driveway, leading to a sprawling mansion. "Whoa," Emma breathed, her eyes wide. "Who lives here?" Mary parked the car and turned to face her children. "Remember how I said we're meeting someone special? Well, they live here, and they've been wanting to meet you for a very long time." The triplets exchanged confused glances as they got out of the car. Mary led them to the front door, her heart pounding. Before she could ring the doorbell, the door swung open. A well-dressed couple stood in the entryway, smiling nervously. "Hello," the woman said softly. "Please, come in." As they stepped into the luxurious foyer, the triplets looked around in awe. The man cleared his throat. "I'm Robert, and this is my wife, Elizabeth. We're your biological parents." The silence that followed was deafening. Ethan and Emma's jaws dropped, while Elijah instinctively moved closer to Mary. "What?" Emma finally whispered. Robert and Elizabeth exchanged a pained look. "Maybe we should sit down," Elizabeth suggested, gesturing to a nearby sitting room. Once seated, Robert began to explain. "When you were born, we were very young and struggling financially. We were scared and didn't think we could provide for you. So, we made the hardest decision of our lives and left you at the orphanage." Elizabeth wiped away a tear. "We thought you'd have a better chance at a good life, but we've regretted it every day since." Ethan leaned forward, his eyes shining with curiosity. "What happened after that? How did you find us?" As Robert and Elizabeth shared their story of building their business and finally feeling ready to search for their children, Mary watched her kids' reactions. Emma seemed captivated, hanging on every word. Ethan was asking questions, clearly intrigued by this new connection. But Elijah sat quietly, his arm protectively around Mary's shoulders. His eyes darted between his biological parents and the woman who had raised him, his expression guarded. "We know we can never make up for the time we lost," Elizabeth said, her voice thick with emotion. "But we'd like to get to know you, if you'll let us." Emma nodded eagerly while Ethan gave a tentative smile. Elijah, however, remained silent. Over the next few days, the triplets' visits to their biological parents' mansion became more frequent. Each time they returned, Mary noticed subtle changes in their behavior and conversation. Ethan and Emma couldn't stop talking about the grand house, the swimming pool, and the fancy dinners. Their eyes sparkled with excitement as they described the latest gadgets and luxuries they'd encountered. "Mom, you should see their library," Ethan gushed one evening. "It's bigger than our whole apartment," Emma chimed in. "And Elizabeth promised to take me shopping next week. Can you believe it?" Mary forced a smile, nodding along to their stories. But her heart felt heavy as she watched their growing fascination with this new world. A world so different from the modest life she had provided. Elijah, on the other hand, remained quiet during these conversations. He'd sit at the kitchen table, his brow furrowed, picking at his food. When Mary asked him about the visits, he'd just shrug and mutter, "It was fine." One evening, as Mary cleared the dinner dishes, she overheard Emma whispering to Ethan, "Do you think we could stay at their place permanently? It'd be so cool." Mary's hands trembled as she washed the plates, trying to push away the fear creeping into her heart. She reminded herself that this was good for the kids. They deserved to know their roots, to have opportunities she couldn't give them. But still, a nagging voice in her head whispered, what if they decide they prefer that life? As the days passed, Mary found herself spending more time alone in their small apartment. The kids were often out, either at the mansion or with friends, leaving the once lively home feeling eerily quiet. "Did I do the right thing?" she whispered to the empty room, her voice cracking with emotion. "Should I have kept this from them?" She knew she wanted what was best for her children, but she couldn't shake the feeling that their family, the family they'd built together through years of love and sacrifice, was slipping away. Elizabeth and Robert, on the other hand, their biological parents, seemed eager to make up for lost time. They showered the triplets with expensive gifts, the latest smartphones, designer clothes, and even talks of new cars when they turned 21. At first, Ethan and Emma were thrilled by the attention and the material comforts. "Can you believe it, Elijah?" Emma gushed one afternoon, twirling in a new dress. "Elizabeth says she'll take me to Paris for Fashion Week next year." Ethan nodded enthusiastically, his eyes glued to his new tablet. "And Robert's promised to introduce me to some of his business contacts. This could be huge for my future." But Elijah remained quiet, his brow furrowed as he watched his siblings' excitement. Something didn't sit right with him about this new arrangement. As days turned into weeks, the initial excitement began to wane. The triplets found themselves navigating an unfamiliar world of formal dinners, social etiquette, and high expectations. The mansion, with its marble floors and priceless artworks, felt more like a museum than a home. They were expected to dress formally for dinner, to mind their manners, and to engage in conversations about business and society, topics that felt alien to them. Moreover, Despite the grand gestures and expensive gifts, Elizabeth and Robert were often absent, caught up in their busy work lives. The triplets found themselves spending more time with household staff than with their biological parents. One evening, after another formal dinner where Robert had spent most of the time on his phone dealing with a work crisis, Elijah couldn't hold back his frustration any longer. He cornered his siblings in the guest room they shared. "Are you two really buying into all of this?" he asked, his voice tight with emotion. "Do you honestly think this life will make us happy?" Emma looked up from her new designer purse, her expression uncertain. "What do you mean, Elijah? They're our parents. They're trying to give us everything we never had." "But at what cost?" Elijah countered. "We barely see them. When we do, it's all about appearances and status. Is that really what family is about?" Ethan, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. "Look, I know it's different from what we're used to," he said, trying to keep his voice calm. "But this is our chance to build a connection with our past, to understand where we come from. Don't you want that?" Elijah ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident in his gesture. "Of course I'm curious about our past," he admitted, "but I can't help feeling like we're betraying Mary. She's the one who's been there for us all these years, who loved us when no one else would." The room fell silent as the weight of Elijah's words sank in. Each of the triplets felt the pull of two worlds, the comfort and familiarity of their life with Mary, and the allure and opportunity of their biological parents' world. Back at her house, Mary stood in her small kitchen, carefully placing the finishing touches on a homemade apple pie. The sweet aroma of cinnamon and baked apples filled the air, bringing back memories of happier times when the triplets were younger. She'd always made this pie for special occasions, and today felt like one. It had been days since she'd seen her children. With a deep breath, Mary wrapped the still warm pie in a checkered cloth and headed out the door. The drive to the wealthy neighborhood where the mansion stood felt longer than usual. Mary's heart raced with anticipation and a touch of anxiety. As the imposing gates of the mansion came into view, Mary straightened her simple dress and patted her hair. She wanted to look her best for her children. With a trembling hand, she pressed the intercom button at the gate. A gruff voice crackled through the speaker. "Yes?" "Hello," Mary said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'm Mary Smith. I'm here to see the triplets, Ethan, Emma, and Elijah." There was a long pause before the voice responded. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but the family is not at home right now." Mary's heart sank, but then she heard something that made her pause. From beyond the gate, the unmistakable sound of laughter drifted on the breeze. It was Emma's laugh. Mary would recognize it anywhere. I think I hear them," Mary said hesitantly. "Are you sure they're not home?" The guard's voice became firmer. "Ma'am, I've told you the family is not available. I'm going to have to ask you to leave the premises." Mary stood there, clutching her pie, feeling as if the ground had dropped out from under her. She could still hear the faint sounds of life from inside the mansion. Voices, laughter, the distant splash of what might have been a pool. Tears began to well up in her eyes as the realization hit her. She was being deliberately kept away. The children she had raised, loved, and sacrificed everything for were now part of a world that had no place for her. With a shaking hand, Mary wiped away a tear before it could fall. She wouldn't let them see her cry, wouldn't let them know how much this hurt. Taking a deep breath, she squared her shoulders and turned away from the gate. As she walked back towards the bus stop, the pie still warm in her hands, Mary's mind raced. She felt humiliated, standing there with her homemade offering like some kind of beggar. But more than that, she felt a deep, aching sadness. Her children, her whole world, were slipping away from her. Inside the sprawling mansion, the triplets found themselves navigating a world far different from the cozy apartment they'd grown up in. Ethan, Emma, and Elijah sat in their lavish shared bedroom, each lost in their own thoughts. The sound of their biological mother's heels clicking on the marble floors outside made them all tense up. "Remember," Ethan whispered, "back straight, elbows off the table." Emma nodded, smoothing her designer dress nervously. "And no talking unless spoken to," she added. Elijah scowled, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. "This is ridiculous. We're not puppets in some show." The door swung open and their biological mother swept in, her perfectly coiffed hair and immaculate suit a stark contrast to the warm, often disheveled appearance of Mary. "Children," she said, her voice crisp, "the Worthingtons will be here any minute. I expect you all to be on your best behavior." Her eyes narrowed as she looked at Elijah. "And please, for once, try to smile." Elijah opened his mouth to retort, but Emma quickly stepped on his foot, silencing him. As they made their way downstairs, the triplets couldn't help but feel the weight of expectations pressing down on them. The grand dining room, with its crystal chandelier and polished silverware, seemed more like a stage than a place for family meals. The dinner progressed with forced smiles and stilted conversation. Emma, usually the most outgoing of the three, found herself shrinking under the critical gaze of their biological mother. When Mrs. Worthington asked Emma about her interests, the young girl's face lit up. "Oh, I love art. Mary, I mean our adoptive mom, she always encouraged us to—" The sharp sound of a hand hitting the table cut Emma off mid-sentence. Their biological mother's eyes flashed with anger. "Emma, we do not speak of that woman in this house, especially not in front of guests." The room fell silent. Emma's cheeks burned with shame and shock. Ethan stared at his plate, unable to look up, while Elijah's fists clenched under the table. "I'm not ashamed of her. She is our real mom. I don't care what some DNA test says. You cannot push her away just because she is black," Emma said. Before anyone could react further, their biological mother's hand struck Emma's cheek with a resounding slap. "How dare you embarrass us like this?" Emma's eyes filled with tears, her hand flying to her stinging cheek. The Worthingtons looked on in uncomfortable silence. Elijah stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Don't you ever touch her again," he growled, his voice low and dangerous. The tension in the room was palpable. Ethan, always the peacemaker, tried to intervene. "Please, let's all calm down. Emma didn't mean any harm." Their biological mother turned her icy gaze on Ethan. "You will all learn your place in this family, or so help me." "Family?" Elijah scoffed. "You don't know the first thing about being a family." As the argument escalated, Emma sat silently, tears streaming down her face. In that moment, all three triplets felt the stark absence of the warmth and unconditional love they had always known with Mary. This grand house, with all its riches, suddenly felt colder and more unwelcoming than ever before. After the disastrous dinner, Ethan, Emma, and Elijah retreated to the living room. The room was spacious and elegantly decorated, but it felt cold and impersonal compared to the cozy space they had shared in Mary's apartment. Emma sat on her bed, her cheek still red from the slap. Tears glistened in her eyes as she hugged a pillow tightly to her chest. Ethan paced back and forth, his brow furrowed with worry. Elijah leaned against the wall, his arms crossed, a storm brewing in his eyes. "I can't believe she hit you," Ethan said softly, breaking the tense silence. Emma sniffled. "It's not just that. I miss Mary." Her voice cracked as she spoke their adoptive mother's name. Elijah's expression softened. He moved to sit beside Emma, putting an arm around her shoulders. "I know, Em. I miss her too." Ethan stopped pacing and joined his siblings on the bed. "Remember how Mary used to make us apple pie on cold nights?" he asked, a wistful smile playing on his lips. Emma nodded, wiping away a tear. "And how she'd always burn the marshmallows because she was trying to do 3 things at once." The trio chuckled softly at the memory. For a moment, they could almost smell the sweet aroma of cocoa mixed with the slight char of overcooked marshmallows. "Or those Sunday dinners," Elijah added. "Mary would spend all day cooking, even though she was exhausted from work." "And we'd all squeeze around that tiny table," Ethan continued. "Remember how the legs would wobble if we leaned too far to one side?" Emma smiled through her tears. "But it didn't matter because we were all together." The siblings fell silent, each lost in their own memories of the simple yet loving home they had shared with Mary. The stark contrast between those warm moments and the cold, rigid atmosphere of their biological parents' mansion was impossible to ignore. As they continued to reminisce, the realization of what they had left behind became clearer. The lavish surroundings and expensive gifts couldn't compare to the warmth and love they had known with Mary. Elijah stood up, determination in his eyes. "We need to go back," he said firmly. "This isn't our home. Mary is our real mom, not her." He gestured vaguely towards the door, referring to their biological mother. Ethan and Emma exchanged glances, then nodded in agreement. "You're right," Ethan said. "We belong with Mary." Emma wiped away the last of her tears and stood up. "So what do we do now?" Elijah took a deep breath. "We need to talk to them. Our biological parents, I mean. We need to tell them that we're going home. Our real home." The next morning, Ethan, Emma, and Elijah stood nervously outside their biological parents' study. They exchanged glances, each taking a deep breath before Elijah knocked on the heavy wooden door. "Come in," called their biological father's voice. The triplets entered the room, finding their biological parents seated behind a large mahogany desk. The couple looked up, surprise flickering across their faces at the serious expressions worn by their children. "Is everything all right? I'm sorry for last night. I shouldn't have snapped like that," their biological mother asked, setting aside the papers she'd been reviewing. Elijah stepped forward, his voice steady despite his nerves. "We need to talk to you both about something important." The biological parents exchanged a worried glance before their father gestured for them to continue. Emma spoke up next, her voice soft but determined. "We appreciate everything you've done for us, and we understand why you made the choices you did when we were babies." Ethan nodded, adding, "But the truth is, we feel like strangers here. This isn't our home." Their biological mother's face fell, hurt evident in her eyes. "But we're your family," she protested weakly. Elijah shook his head gently. "You're our biological parents, yes. But Mary, she's our mom. She's the one who raised us, who was there for every scraped knee and every bad dream." "We want to go back to her," Emma said, her eyes welling with tears. "She's our family in every way that matters." The room fell silent as their words sank in. The biological parents looked at each other, a mix of emotions playing across their faces. Hurt, disappointment, and slowly, understanding. Their biological father leaned forward, his voice heavy with emotion. "We can't pretend this doesn't hurt. We had hoped to make up for lost time. But we can see how much Mary means to you," their mother added, her voice cracking slightly. "And we can't replace the bond you have with her." The triplets felt a wave of relief wash over them. They hadn't expected their biological parents to understand so quickly. "We're sorry," Ethan said sincerely. "We didn't mean to hurt you. We miss our home, our real home." Their biological father nodded slowly. "We understand. And we're sorry too. We should have realized that you can't just pick up a family where you left off." "Maybe," their mother added hesitantly, "we could still be a part of your lives, just in a different way." The triplets looked at each other, then nodded. "We'd like that," Emma said with a small smile. With heavy hearts but a sense of rightness, the triplets began to pack their things. As they folded clothes and gathered the few personal items they'd brought, they reflected on the past few days. "You know," Ethan said, carefully wrapping a framed photo of the three of them with Mary, "I think I understand now what real family means." Emma nodded, zipping up her suitcase. "It's not about big houses or fancy dinners. It's about love," Elijah finished, a smile spreading across his face. "And nobody loves us like Mary does." As they prepared to leave the mansion, each of them felt a mixture of relief and sadness. They were leaving behind the possibility of a life they had once dreamed about, but they were returning to the warmth and love of the home they had always known. The triplets then reached outside the familiar door of Mary's apartment, their hearts pounding. Elijah held the handle of his suitcase tightly, while Emma fidgeted with the strap of her backpack. Ethan took a deep breath and raised his hand to knock. The sound echoed in the quiet hallway, and for a moment there was silence. Then they heard footsteps approaching. The door opened slowly, revealing Mary's face. Her eyes, red-rimmed and puffy, widened in disbelief as she took in the sight of her children standing before her. "Ethan? Emma? Elijah?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Hi, Mom," Elijah said softly, his own eyes filling with tears. Mary's hand flew to her mouth, stifling a sob. She stood frozen for a moment, as if afraid they might disappear if she blinked. Emma stepped forward, her voice thick with emotion. "We're home, Mom. If you'll still have us." That broke the spell. Mary surged forward, wrapping her arms around all three of them at once. She held them tightly, her tears falling freely now. "Oh, my babies," she cried, her voice muffled against their shoulders. "Of course I'll have you. You're always welcome here. This is your home." The triplets hugged her back just as fiercely, their own tears mingling with hers. For a long moment, they stood there in the doorway, clinging to each other. Finally, Mary pulled back slightly, cupping each of their faces in turn. "Come inside," she said, ushering them into the small but cozy apartment. As they settled on the worn but comfortable couch, the familiar scent of home enveloping them, the triplets exchanged glances. It was time to apologize. Ethan spoke first, his voice filled with remorse. "Mom, we're so sorry. We never should have left like that." "We got caught up in the idea of having a privileged life," Emma added, her eyes downcast. "But we realize that doesn't mean anything compared to the love and care you've given us our whole lives." Elijah reached out and took Mary's hand. "You're our real mom, the only one we've ever needed. We understand now what family truly means." Mary listened, her eyes brimming with fresh tears. She squeezed Elijah's hand, her voice soft but steady. "I love you all so much. I was so afraid I'd lost you." "Never," Emma said firmly. "We belong here, with you." Mary pulled them into another embrace, her heart overflowing with relief and joy. As she held her children close, she felt the weight of the past few days lifting from her shoulders. "Welcome home," she whispered, her voice filled with love and gratitude. "Welcome home, my darlings." The triplets gathered around her, enveloping her in a group hug. As Mary held her family close, she realized that despite all the hardships they had faced, she had gained everything she had ever wished for. A family bound by love and resilience stronger than ever before. If you enjoyed the story of Mary, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.